We are now at the chapter 19, which is the Latin America. So along the discussion, we will encounter additional information and different people in the history. So under the chapter 19, we have the following: the Castro brothers, the general trends in America, Latin America society, Mexico, Cuba, and Central America, and lastly, the nation of the South America. So let's proceed to the Castro brothers, led by Fidel Castro. So Fidel Castro was a Cuban revolutionary and politician who served as a prime minister of Cuba. After participating in rebellions in Dominican Republic, he overthrew Fulgencio Batista, launching a failed attack on the Moncada Barracks. So this Moncada Barracks is a military barracks in Santiago de Cuba in 1953. After a one-year imprisonment, together with his brothers Raul, Raul Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara, they traveled to Mexico to form a revolutionary group against Batista forces. So Castro go back to Cuba and had promised a return to the Constitution, land reform, and improved health and welfare services. So at first, Castro government did become the source of hope for many Cubans. So he confiscated lands and distributed among the farmers. He set up health clinics and made education a priority for everyone. But he did not follow his promise to political freedom when elections were held. So people were able to vote only from a list of approved candidates, but not to political dissents were not allowed. So Castro's effort to establish a functioning centralizing economy, of course, it failed. Despite help from Cuban main ally, which is the Soviet Union, that help ended in 1989 when the Soviet Communist Party fell from the power. So Cuban conditions worsened and the high hopes of the Cuban Revolution were left unfulfilled. So why it matters? So since 1945, the nation of Latin America has followed different paths of change. So example of this is the Castro brothers, which they used the Marxist revolution to create a new political, economic, and social order. So many Latin American nations have struggled to build democratic system, especially since the late 1980s. The Cold War has also had an impact on Latin America. Let's proceed to the general trends in America. Voices from the past. One Latin American observer discussed the United States invasion of Panama in 1989. The first official reason for the invasion of Panama was to protect American lives there. This pretext was not credible, for the cry of the wolf has been used before in Latin America. The danger to American lives is 100 times greater every day and night in Washington, D.C., the murder capital of the United States, and in other American cities to which President Bush has hardly applied his policy of protecting North American lives in waging against drugs. So according to Latin American Civilization, History and Society 1942 to the present. Let's proceed to the economic and political development. Since the 19th century, Latin America had exported raw materials while buying manufactured goods from industrialized countries. So as a result of a Great Depression, the export fell, and the revenues that had been used to buy manufactured goods declined. So pakonti ng pakonti yung mga manufactured goods. In response, many Latin American countries developed industries to produce goods and were formerly imported. These are the U.S. involvement in Latin America since 1945. So we will discuss this in the following discussion. So Mexico, we have Nicaragua, Panama, and we also have Colombia, Chile, Cuba, which we discussed. In 1959, Marxist Castro overthrew dictator Batista, and the following we will also discuss Brazil, and lastly Argentina. So ang dami nating na-involved na countries in Latin America since 1945. At dahil nagkaroon ng Great Depression, by the 1960s, Latin America became dependent to United States, Europe, and Japan, especially for the advanced technology needed for modern industries. So they failed to find market abroad to sell manufactured products. At dahil economic failed led to instability and reliance on military regime, in the 1960s, repressive military regime in Chile, Brazil, and Argentina abolished political parties and returned to export-import economies financed by foreigners. This made these Latin American countries even more dependent on industrialized nations. In the 1970s, Latin American nations grew more dependent to maintain their weak economies by borrowing money. So between 1970s to 1982, debt to foreigners grew from 27 billion to 315.3 billion. By 1982, several Latin American economies had begun to crumble. At dahil doon, bumaba yung sahod at nagkaroon ng unemployment. So to get new loans, Latin American governments were forced to make basic reform. And during doon sa process na yon, maraming tao ang naniwala sa government na sila ang may control sa maraming industries, trying to industrialize that too quickly na nagled sa pagbaba ng ekonomiya. So many hope that peasants grow food for home consumption. At the same time, they believe na madaming taong makakabili ng products from Latin American industries. At dahil nga nagkaroon ng debt crisis, in 1980s come to movement towards democracy. Some military leaders were unwilling to help with the Latin American with these debt problems. At the same time, many people realized that military power without popular consent could not maintain a strong state by the mid-1990s. So several democratic regimes have been established. The movement toward democracy was the most noticeable trend of the 1980s and early 1990s in Latin America. So this revival of democracy was fragile in 1992 by President Alberto Fujimori returned to Peru to an authorized system. So let's proceed to the Latin American society. At dahil nagkaroon ng crisis, dumagdag na rin dito ang population ng Latin America by 200,050 cities in Latin America, and the Caribbean more than 1 million people. At dahil sa paglaki ng population, masasabi natin na lalabas dito ang standard of living, wherein nandyan yung mga poor and rich. Pag mayaman ka, may lupa at business ka. Samantalang sa mga mahihirap, humahanap sila ng kabubuhay nila. So the traditional role of homemaker continues to women who had also moved into new jobs. In addition to farm labor, women have found jobs in the industry and as a teachers, professors, doctors, and lawyers. Next is, dadagdag na rin dito ang involvement ng drugs trade sa mga Latin Americans, undermining the stability. Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia were especially big producers of cocaine and marijuana. So the United States and Latin America, the United States has always played a large role in Latin America. For years, The United States had sent troops into Latin American countries to protect U.S. interests and bolster friendly dictators. In 1948, dito na mabubuo ang OAS, or the Organization of American States from the State of the Western Hemisphere, which called for an end to military action by one state in the affairs of any other state. The formation of the OAS, however, did not end U.S. involvement sa Latin American affairs. So as the Cold War developed, so too did the anxiety of American policymakers about the possibility of communist regime in Latin America. So as a result, the United States returned to a policy of taking action when it believed that Soviet agents were trying to establish communist government or governments hostile to United States interests. So the United States also provide massive amounts of military aid to anti-communist regimes. So connection around the world. At dahil nga na-mention to the previous slide is about women, dito nalalabas ang International Women's Conference. So, ano nga ba to? As a women around the world organize movement to change the conditions of their lives, an international women's movement emerged. So, especially in the 1970s, much attention was paid to a series of international conferences on women's issue. So, between 1975 to 1985, the United Nations celebrated the decade for women by holding conferences in such cities as Mexico City, Copenhagen, and Nairobi. So the conference made clear between the difference between women from the Western and non-Western countries. So they focus women from Western countries who spoke about political, economic, culture, and sexual rights. In contrast, women from the developing countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia focus on bringing an end to violence, hunger, and disease that haunt their lives. So example of this, at the International Women's Year Tribunal in Mexico in 1974, sponsored by the United Nations, Dimitila Barrios Lechuga, a miner's wife from Bolivia, expressed her lack of patience with professional women at the conference. She said, "So I went up and spoke. I made them see that they don't live in our world. I made them see that in Bolivia, human rights aren't respected. Women like us, housewives, who get organized to better our people, well, they beat us up and persecute us." So in here, women's voice are important. So that's why they have international women's conferences. So let's proceed to the Latin American culture. So in here, writers and artists are the most talked about. Why? Because in Latin America, writers and artists are people who can express the hope of the people. One celebrated Latin American writer is the Chilean poet Gabriela Mistral. In literature, Latin American developed a unique form of expression called magic realism, wherein they bring together realistic events with dreamlike or fantastic backgrounds, like you see in the PowerPoint. Perhaps the foremost example of magic realism is The 100 Years of Solitude, a novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. In this story of the fictional town of Mocondo, the point of view slips back and forth between facts and fantasy. Villagers are not surprised when local priest rises into the air and floats. However, when these villagers are introduced to magnets, telescopes, and magnifying glasses, they are dumbfounded by what they see as magic. So according to Garcia Marquez, fantasy and fact depend on one's point of view. So digging deeper to Garcia Marquez, so he is a Colombian was the most famous of the Latin American novelists. He was a former journalist who took up writing when he became angered by the negative reviews Latin American authors were receiving. So he was awarded by the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982. So Latin American art and literature were influenced after World War, and notable example of the modern architecture can be seen in Brasilia, the capital city of Brazil, built in the 1950s and 1960s. Latin America's greatest modern architect, Oscar Niemeyer, designed some of the major buildings in Brasilia. So people in history a while ago mentioned is Gabriela Mistral, 1889-1857, her Chilean poet. So Gabriela Mistral, whose real name was Lucila Godoy Alcayaga, was a poet and educator. She was trained to be a teacher and became the director of a school for girls in Santiago, Chile in 1922. So she was invited by the Mexican government to introduce educational programs for the poor in the country. Later, she took up residence in the United States and taught as Middlebury and Barnard College. So in 1945, she became the first Latin American author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Her poems explored the many dimensions of love, tinged with an element of sadness. So as I mentioned, writers and artists are the hope for Latin Americans. So a recap from the preview of events. So 1948, we had the Organization of American States was formed. 1980, a movement toward democracy take place in Latin America. 1982, Gabriela Garcia wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. And lastly, 1990, 29 Latin American cities have a million people. And now let's proceed to the Mexico, Cuba, and Central America. So, Voices from the Past. Another story for Nancy Danovan, a Catholic missionary in Nicaragua, described her encounter with the military forces known as the Contras. She said that it is not easy to live in a war zone. The least of it was my being kidnapped by Contras early this year. The hard part is seeing people die and consoling families. In those 8 hours I was held, as I walked in a column of 60 or so men and few women, all in uniform, I could hear I could hear shooting and realize that people I knew were being killed. Earlier I had seen bodies brought back to town, some burned, some cut to pieces. So from Latin American Civilization, History and Society 1492 to the present, Benjamin Keane, 1996. Next is the Mexican Way. So in Mexican Revolution, Mexican created a political order. Their official party is the Institutional Revolutionary Party or the PRI. So doon, every 6 years, leaders of the PRI will choose the party's presidential candidate na inelect ng mga tao. So during 1950s and 1960s, with steady economic growth, maraming tao ang nakuhanan ng mga wages sa Mexico. So at the end of the 1960s, nagkaroon ng protest ang mga students against the government policy. So police forces opened fire and killed hundreds of them. So leaders of the PRI grew concerned about the needs for change in the system. At dahil maraming namatay sa protest nila against government policies, nagkaroon na ng emergence of the new political parties. So the next two presidents, Luis Echeverria and Lopez Portillo made a political reform. So in the late 1970s, new reserves of oil discovered in Mexico, and by this the government became more dependent. So the sale of oil abroad increased. So when the oil dropped in mid-1980, di na sila nakapagbayad ng utang nila. But the government adopted a new economic policies. A new economic policies which is the privatization. So privatization is a transfer of a business, industry, or service from a public to private ownership and control. So the debt crisis and rising unemployment increased dissatisfaction with the government. Support for the PRI also dropped, and in 2000, Vicente Fox defeated the PRI candidate for presidency. Next is the Cuban Revolution. So in 1950, a strong opposition movement arose in Cuba led by Fidel Castro. The movement aimed to overthrow the government of a dictator Fulgencio Bautista, who had controlled Cuba since 1934. So Castro's revolutionaries seized Havana on January 3, 1959. Many Cubans who disagreed with Castro fled to the United States. So relations between Cuba and United States quickly deteriorated when the Castro regime began to receive aid from the Soviet Union. So arms from the Eastern Europe also began to arrive in Cuba. In October 1960, the United States declared a trade embargo, so prohibiting trade with Cuba, and just 3 months later, on January 3, 1961, of course, they broke all diplomatic relations with Cuba. Soon after that, President Kennedy supported to overthrow Castro's government because he failed to invade the Bay of the Pigs. By then, Castro declared himself a Marxist to become close to the Soviet Union, and by that, Soviet began placing nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962. Ernesto Che Guevara, on the other hand, led a war in Bolivia but was killed in 1967. The Cuban strategy failed. Castro's regime continued by providing free medical services for all citizens. Cuban economy continued to rely on production and sale of sugar, but the Castro regime depended on Soviet aid and the purchase of Cuban sugar by the Soviet bloc countries because of economic problems. With this, Cuba's economic condition declined. Castro has managed to remain in power. Upheaval in Central America. Central America includes 7 countries: Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Panama, Belize, and Guatemala. Economically, Central America has depended on the export of banana, coffee, and cotton. Prices for these products have varied over time, however, creating economic crisis. In addition, an enormous gulf between a wealthy elite and poor peasant has created a climate of instability. Fear in the United States of the spread of communism often led to American support for repressive regimes in the area. American involvement was especially evident in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Panama. So we will start with El Salvador. El Salvador was rocked by the bitter civil war, where Marxist-led leftist guerrillas and right-wing groups battled one another, and because of this, the United States provided weapons and training to Salvadorian army to defeat the guerrillas during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. In 1984, on the other hand, a moderate Jose Duarte was elected as president but failed to stop savage killings. Civil war led to multiple deaths, and by 1992, peace settlement brought the war to an end. In Nicaragua government has controlled by the Somozas family in 1937. and kept control for the next 42 years. The regime had the support of the United States. They enriched themselves at the nation's expense and used murder and torture to silence opposition. The regime was overthrown in 1979 by the Sandinistas National Liberation Front during the Nicaraguan Revolution. Under President Jimmy Carter had grown unwilling to support the corrupt regime. Sandinista National Liberation Front won a number of military victories against government forces and gained virtual control of the country. The Sandinista inherited a poverty-stricken nation. The Reagan and Bush administration in the United States, worried by the Sandinistas' alignment with Soviet Union, support the Contras. In 1903, Panama became a nation when it broke against Colombia with the help of United States. In return, Panama was able to build the Panama Canal and gain influence in government and economy. After 1968, military leaders of Panama's National Guard were in control. One of these, Manuel Noriega, became so involved in the drug trade that President George Bush sent the U.S. troops to Panama in 1989. Noriega was later sent to prison in the United States for drug trafficking. The United States took over the project in 1904. After the period of United States Panamanian control, the canal was taken over by the Panama government in 1999. People in history. Rigoberta Menchú, 1959, a Guatemalan activist. Rigoberta Menchú is a reformer who worked to save her fellow Quench Indians from the murder squads of the Guatemalan government. She grew up in a poor family. Her father helped organize a peasant movement, but she and her other family members were killed by government troops. Rigoberta Menchú then began to play an active role in her father's government. Condemned by the Guatemalan government, she fled to Mexico. Her autobiography, I, Rigoberta Menchú, brought world attention to the fact that 150,000 Native Americans killed by the Guatemalan authorities. In 1992, she received the Nobel Peace Prize and used the money from the award to set up a foundation to help Native Americans. So the previews of events. In 1959, Castro's revolutionaries seized Havana. 1961, United States break diplomatic relations with Cuba. 1979, the Sandinistas overthrew Somoza's rule in Nicaragua. 1983, Noriega takes control of Panama. And lastly, 2000, Vicente Fox defeats the PRI candidate for the presidency of Mexico.
Good morning, each and everyone. So, before anything else, I will first introduce myself. I am Mr. Rika G. Kura, taking up a Bachelor of Secondary Education major in Social Studies, coming from Trivi. So, I am the second reporter, or I will going to continue the report on the chapter 22, Latin America, 1945 to present time. So, I will going to continue the report of Miss Raven Isel Hoves. So she already discussed about the Castro brothers, the general trends in America, Latin America society, Mexico, Cuba, and Central America. And now the latter part I will discuss about the nations of South America, which is the section 3, the nations of South America. And now we will upon hearing the voices from the past. was written by Benjamin King in 1996. So he was stated that in 1974, a group of Brazilian Catholic priests talked about an economic miracle that had taken place in Brazil. Beginning in 1968, Brazil's gross domestic product grew to an annual rate of about 10%. So the consequences of this miracle were the impoverishment of the Brazilian people between 1960 and 1970. The 20% of the population with the highest income increased its share of the national income from 54.4% to 64.1%, while the remaining 80% saw its share to reduce from 45.5% to 36.8%. In the same period, the 1% of the population that represents the richest group increased its share of the national income from 11.7 to 17%. So the countries of South America started in the economic, political, and social problems that plagued Latin America after 1945. So we will discuss the countries of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, provided the example of these different problems that they encountered in the past. So first, a country that we will discuss is about Argentina. So Argentina is the Latin America's second largest country. So for years, it had been ruled by a power of oligarchy, whose wealth was based on growing wheat and raising cattle. Support from the army was crucial to the continuing power of the oligarchy. When we say oligarchy, it is a power structure in which power rests with a small number of people. So these people may be distinguished as by nobility, wealth, education, uh, corporate, religious, political, or military control. So in 1943, during World War II, a group of army officers overthrew the oligarchy. So the new military regime was unsure of how to deal with the working class until one of its members, Juan Perón, devised a new strategy. So Juan Perón devised a new strategy. So what kind of strategy? So using his position as labor secretary government, Perón sought to win over the workers, known as the descamisados, the shirtless ones. He encouraged them to join the labor unions. He also increased job benefits as well as the number of paid holidays and vacation. When we say descamisados or the shirtless one, in Spanish term or in the Latin America, that it was literally means without shirt or shirtless ones. So in our layman terms, they are the very poor people at that time. So he get their empathy, their their heart. So Peron has a good strategy because he's getting the heart of the masses. In 1994, Peron became vice president of the military government and made sure that people knew he was responsible for better conditions for workers. As Peron grew more popular, however, other army officers began to fear his power and they arrested him. An uprising by workers forced the officers to back down. So, of course, as Peron uh, started to become famous and loved by the masses, we could uh, say that there's a lot of army officers began to uh, intrigue and fear his power, so they arrested him. That's so. Peron was elected president of Argentina in 1946. His chief support came from labor and the urban middle class, and to please them he followed a policy of increased industrialization. At the same time, he sought to free Argentina from foreign investors. The government bought the railways and took over the banking, insurance, shipping, and communication industries. So, yeah, we could say that uh, Peron is working progressively and he's acting on his words. So he first the strategy is to get the heart of the masses by simply hearing the voices. So after hearing um, the voices of the masses, so he started to work on it and build these concrete solutions enabled to uh, enabled to satisfy the needs of the masses. And for my personal opinions, Peron is making uh, a good actions on this period of time. Unfortunately, Peron's regime was authoritarian, so he created fascist gangs modeled after Hitler's brown shirts. So the gangs use violent means to terrify Peron's opponents. So fearing Peron's power, the military overthrew the Argentinian leader in September 1955. Of course, if there was an oppression that had been taking place, so the military intervention will take place. So Peron was uh, overthrown on his seat that time in September 1955. So Peron went into exile in Spain, overwhelmed by problems. However, military leaders later allowed Peron to return, so he was re-elected as president in 1973 but died a year later. In 1976, the military once again took over power, so the new regime tolerated no opposition. Perhaps 36,000 people were killed. So imagine that kind of destructions on the humanitarian domain, where 36,000 people were killed. So that was very inhumane. And I could conclude that that was a drastic period of Argentinian people at that time. So at the same time, economic problems plagued the nation. To divert people's attention, the military regime invaded the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina in April 1982. Great Britain, which had controlled the island since the 19th century, they sent ships and troops and took the island back. The loss discredited the military and opened the door to civilian rule in Argentina. So they they have to do that uh, enable to cover up those different distractions on the past that they have done, so they can able to make some good thing. So in 1963, Raul Alfonsín was elected president and worked to restore democratic practices. The Peronist Carlos Saul Menem won the presidential elections of 1989. So this peaceful transfer of power gave rise to the hope that Argentina was moving on a democratic path. After we discuss Argentina, we will move forward to another country, which is Brazil. So Brazil experienced severe economic problems following World War II, when democratically elected governments proved unable to solve these problems. the military stepped in the seas control in 1964. So after the remnants of World War II, governments of Brazil proved that they are incapable on addressing this different problem arise. So the military intervention stepped in the seas control in 1964. So the military set a new economic direction. So reducing government interference in the economy and stressing free market forces. Beginning in 1968, the new policy seems to be working. Brazil experienced an economic miracle as its economy grew spectacularly. And beforehand that we have been mentioned, coming from the voices from the past, this was the economic miracle that was mentioned beforehand. So let's see the picture, which is the headline is Brazil economic miracle and its collapse. So what's the meaning of miracle and its collapse? So we will talk about on the next slide. So ordinary Brazilians benefited little from this economic growth. Furthermore, rapid development led to an inflation rate of 100% a year. Overwhelmed generals retreated and opened the door to return to democracy in 1985. So, the new democratic government faced enormous obstacles, massive foreign debt, and an inflation rate of 800% in 1987. So in 1990s, democratic presidents restored some stability to the economy, but the gap between rich and poor remained wide. Dissatisfaction with this gap helped elect Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in 2002. Lula was Brazil's left-wing president in 4 decades. So that was the reason behind between and the reason behind of the Brazilians' economic miracle and its collapse. And now let us feature some people in history. We will talk about Eva Peron, 1919 to 1952, Argentine First Lady. So Eva Peron, known as Evita to her followers, was the First Lady of Argentina from 1946 to 1952. Raised in poverty, Eva dreamed of being an actress. So at 15, she moved to Buenos Aires, Argentina's largest city, where she eventually gained fame as the radio performer. Eva met Juan Perón in 1944 and became his wife a year later. She was an important force in her husband's rise to power. Together, they courted the working class, poor with promises of higher wages and better working conditions. As the First Lady, Eva Peron formed a charitable organization that built hospitals, schools, and orphanages. She campaigned for women's rights. The messages adored her. To this day, monuments and street names in Argentina kept her memory alive. The American musical and movie Evita are based on her life. So, taking up a scripture on the Bible, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. So, we will find that scriptures at Proverbs 12 verse 4. So we could say and we can conclude based on the biography of Eva Peron. He was a good wife to his husband and he was a crown to his husband. And now we'll move forward to Chile. In elections held in 1970, Salvador Allende, a Marxist, became president of Chile. Allende tried to create a socialist society by constitutional means. He increased the wages of industrial workers and nationalized the largest domestic and foreign-owned corporations. When we say Marxist, so they want and they foster equal treatment, fair treatment, classless societies, socialists like that. So Allende's policies were not popular with everyone. Nationalization of the copper industry, Chile's major source of export income, angered the copper companies, American owners, as well as the American government. Wealthy landholders were angry when radical workers began to take control of their estates, and government did nothing to stop these takeovers. So, in the first place, we could say that Allende's policies could be good, and the latter part, when radical workers starting to control these estates and taking over, taking possessions uh, on those companies. So, uh, government tolerated, and of course, um, American owners, copper companies owners, as well as the government, American government, would be angered to Allende's policies. So in March 1973, new elections increased the number of Allende's supporters in Chilean Congress. Afraid of Allende's growing strength, the Chilean army under the direction of General Augusto Pinochet moved to overthrow the government. In September 1973, military forces seized the presidential palace, resulting in Allende's death. The military then set up a dictatorship. So, fortunately, Allende's death because of a ruling of General Augusto Pinochet in overthrowing the government and the residing of uh, Allende's. So the Pinochet regime was one of the most brutal in Chile's history. Thousands of opponents were imprisoned. Thousands more were tortured and murdered. The regime also outlawed all political parties and did away with the Congress. While some estates and industries were returned to their owners, the copper industries remained in government hands. The regime's horrible abuses of human rights led to growing unrest in the mid-1980s. In 1989, free presidential elections led to defeat of Pinochet, and Chile moved towards a more democratic system. And now we will talk about Peru. Peru's dependence on the sale abroad of its products has led to extreme ups and downs in the economy. With these ups and downs have came many government changes. A large poor and landless peasants population has created an additional source of unrest. A military takeover in 1968 led to some change. General Juan Velasco Alvarado sought to help the peasants. His government seized almost 75% of the nation's large landed estates and put ownership of the land into hands of peasants' cooperative, farm organization owned by the operated for the peasants' benefit. The government also nationalized any foreign-owned companies and held food prices at low levels to help urban workers. So it was amazing deed that was led by Juan Velasco Alvarado. New problems made the task of the civilian government group based in rural areas, known as the Shining Fat. So here come the Shining Fat. killed mayors, missionaries, priests, and peasants. The goal of Shining Path was to smash all authorities and create classless society. So in 1990, Peruvians chose Alberto Fujimori as president. Fujimori, the son of a Japanese immigrant, promised reforms. 2 years later, he suspended the constitution and Congress, became a dictator, and began a campaign against Shining Path guerrillas. Corruption led to his ouster from power in 2000. In June 2001, Alejandro Toledo became the first freely elected president of Native American descent. And after we talk about Peru, we'll talk about Colombia. After World War II, Marxist guerrilla groups began to organize Colombian peasants. The government responded violently. More than 200,000 peasants have been killed by the mid-1960s. Violence continued in the 1980s and 1980s. So after post-World War, a very drastic period between mid-90s and around 1980s to 1990s on the Colombian state. So violence continued on that period of times. Colombia became the major supplier of the international drug market. Violence has increased as rebel guerrillas made deal with the drug cartels to oppose the government. The government used an aerial eradication program to try and wipe out cocaine fields, but without much success. The United States funded the anti-drug program, and in 2003 sent Special Forces troops to support it. The Colombian economy remained weak because of high unemployment and because of the civil war. A new president elected in 2002, Alvaro Uribe, promised to track down hard on rebel groups. And now we will go into the preview of events. 1946, Juan Perón is elected as President of Argentina. 1973, military forces overthrow Allende presidency in Chile. 1982, Argentina sent troops in the Falkland Islands. In 2001, Alejandro Toledo is elected President of Peru. On our chapter summary, for this, we have categories: countries, conflicts, revolution, change, and cooperation. From Cuba, so conflicts, they experience corruption and cancelled election, create unrest. Under revolution, Castro ousts Bautista. Change, Castro improves social welfare system but suspends election. In cooperation, Castro allows limited foreign investments, improving relations with Canada and other countries. And moving to Nicaragua, so conflicts experienced by Nicaragua: repressive Somoza regime owns a quarter of the country's land. So in revolution, social movement led by Sandinistas overthrows Somoza in 1979. Sandinistas initiate social reforms but are hampered by Contras for the change. And cooperation, Sandinistas regime agrees to hold free elections in 1990. Chamorro is elected president. Moving back to Mexico, PRI dominates. That was the conflicts under Mexico. On the revolution, university students protest government policies. On the change, PRI allows new political parties and more freedoms. In cooperation in Mexico, elects non-PRI candidate as presidents. And moving forward to Argentina, conflicts, So one of the conflicts of the Argentina is economy is poor. Revolution, Argentine military overthrows Peron. Change, economy recovers, mainly citizens love lives to death squad. Cooperation, democracy is gradually restored, and Falkland Island disaster. In El Salvador, conflicts, elites control most wealth and land. Revolution, leftist guerrillas and right-wing group battled. Change, UN-sponsored peace agreement ends civil war in 1992. Economy grows, ties with neighbors are renewed. And that was the chapter summary of the chapter 22, which is Latin America. In valuing, in Latin America, as elsewhere, the close of World War II was accompanied by expectations, only partly fulfilled, of steady economic development and democratic consolidation. Economies grew, but at a slower rate than in most of Europe or East Asia, so that Latin America's relative share of world production and trade declined and the gap in personal income per capita, separating it from the leading industrial democracies, increased. Popular education also increased, as did exposure to the mass media and mass culture, which in light of the economic lag served to feed dissatisfaction. Military dictatorship and Marxist revolution were among the solutions put forward, but none were truly successful. And that's so, we must learn from the past. Where a specific country commits mistake and failure, make this as a lesson and always remember that there was a room for improvement. Like us, we as a human in some part of our lives, we fail, we stumbled, we fall. But the good thing is we must take this positively. We must learn from our mistakes, that this failure turns into a life lesson and eventually an application. Yes, we fail, we rise. We are perfectly incomplete, still working on ourselves and crafting our own masterpieces. And that would be all. Thank you for listening.